Um, Evening, folks. My name is Mary Gallagher. I'm with the JTG committee, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's discussion on the EU Just Transition funding and the draft territorial plan that's currently open for consultation. And I suppose just to put it in context, the energy transition is one of many transitions we'll need to make to ensure a safe operating space for humanity. And I suppose if you're reading enough of the reports at the moment, we're perilously close to the rocks in terms of planetary boundaries. But we do have a chance to mitigate, adapt and transform. And genuine just transitions are key to this. And Ireland, as a high emitting, high income country, needs to play a significant part in it. We have three guests and friends of JTG here this evening with valuable expertise relevant to this evening's topic. I'll introduce them briefly. Then we're going to hear from each speaker in turn. We'll then take questions from all of our guests here directly on what they raised, and then move on to a kind of more open and broad discussion. Feel free to use the chat function with questions that pop into your head, and you'll be welcome to pose your questions yourself or have myself or Ben read them out. As Ben already said, this section is being recorded, and the second part we'll stop recording to ensure that people can kind of participate as freely as you might wish. So just to introduce our speakers, Councillor Louise Heavin is a Green Party councillor in the Midlands who wears several hats in her representative capacity that are relevant to just transition activities. She's chair of the Planning and Transport SPC for Westmeath County Council, chair of the Westmeath Heritage Forum, director at Athlone Arts and Tourism, a board member of the Longford Westmeath Education and Training Board. Then we're also delighted to have Macdara Dolye, who's the campaigns officer for the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. A key campaign area of ICTU is in the energy sector and securing a just transition for workers and their communities. From ICTU's website, they put it perfectly. A plan for just transition provides and guarantees better and decent jobs, social protection, more training opportunities, and greater job security for all workers affected by global warming and climate change policies. Seán McCabe is a climate justice expert, Bohemians Football Club's first ever climate justice officer, and formerly executive manager of think tank Task, where he led the work on the people's transition, among many, many other things. So folks, I'll hand it over to you, and I might start with Macdara, if that's okay, please. We had posed three kind of broad questions around your take on just transition activities to date in the Midlands, what we can learn from your observations and your experiences on the ground that could translate into meaningful actions. And then also if you have a view on the gaps, funding or otherwise, that need to be matched by the government to realise the vision for a just transition in the Midlands. So over to you, Macdara.
Okay, thank you. And maybe if I just focus, I think, primarily on the Midlands and what we've learned and what we failed to learn, possibly. So, I mean, look, if you go back to the starting point of this, and if you kind of take it as read that the Irish government has endorsed and is committed to a just transition, and we've no reason to believe otherwise because they signed the 2015 Paris Agreement, which was the first agreement to actually reference just transition. The Cllr Declaration, they supported that. And then latterly we had the COP26 Just Transition Pledge, which the Irish government also signed up to. And if you take all the other pieces in between as well, where they've indicated support, so the EU Recovery Plan for Europe sees just transition as being a core policy aim. The UN's Common Agenda report, which calls on all countries globally to embrace the just transition as part of the carbon transition process and the overall process. So when you take all of these pieces as indicative of the position of this government, of successive governments on the issue of just transition, it becomes extremely difficult and extremely puzzling to try and explain and understand what has actually happened and unfolded in the Midlands over the last few years, because what has happened has not been a just transition by any standard. And just a bit of context on this, the first just transition plan in Ireland was agreed by management and unions in Bord na Móna in 2016. And when it was put to the workforce, there was overwhelming support and it was voted through overwhelmingly. And those negotiations, I suppose they developed a plan that would have seen the planned, the managed and ordered wind down of the peat sector of the industry, the peat harvesting industry, over about a decade. So it allowed people to exit the sector with a bit of dignity and a certain degree of security, which they don't always have. As we know, legal challenges emerged. And it's my estimation and my belief, or our belief, that both government and the company opportunistically then used the cover of the legal challenges to to tear up the agreement, accelerate the shutdown, the close down, and simply walk away from the communities and the workers. They had an opportunity at that stage. I mean, the legal challenges themselves were a problem, but they weren't the problem. They presented a new context or a new scenario, and government had the opportunity at that stage to step in and try and rescue that plan and rescue that process. And in doing so, they would have sent a significant signal to both the workforce in the Midlands and across the country, and to the wider public, that they were supporting and standing by Just Transition as the only really effective means to deliver on this. They didn't do that. And in the process, they caused enormous damage to the Midlands and to the prospects of delivering a genuine just transition across the wider economy. The workers in Bord na Móna had that very small degree of security and dignity stripped away from them. About 1,000 jobs have been lost in an area that already has, poor employment prospects. And a process that was supposed to take probably a decade, and which had their support, so there was no issue of Luddites or anything like that, which had their support, was suddenly compressed into about 12 months. So you can imagine the absolute shock across the community when that began to unfold, and the shock that has reverberated since. And that's not to mention, of course, the jobs that have been lost and will be lost downstream in the Midlands, in Midlands economy, and coming job losses within the company over the next 2 to 3 years, because there will be more. And despite repeated and claims from both the company and the government, not a single new replacement job has been created in the Midlands for that workforce, for that displaced workforce. Not a single one. We heard, some statements from the company recently saying they were creating X amount of jobs. Included in that number were 300 jobs that were already in existence. They were just moved from one sector to another, and they were classified as newly created jobs. They're not. They are classically what have been defined as deferred redundancies. There are people who've managed to hold on to their jobs for maybe an extra 2 years. So equally, quite apart from the employment issues, very little money has actually gone into the communities to address these issues. I mean, you have the Just Transition Fund, the National Just Transition Fund, and they've been approving grants for projects over the last couple of years. The vast majority of those projects, I've looked at them, there's about 44 so far, have been approved, have a tenuous connection to the affected workforce and their needs, or to the immediate job creation demands of the area. They're funding tourism, they're funding a plethora of feasibility studies into a vast range of things that may never come to fruition, and they're funding the creation of new office space. Out of the 44 projects that have been approved for funding, 4 relate to providing direct training and upskilling for Bord na Móna workers. 4 out of 44. So I think that's actually the complete and total reverse of what should be the situation. So Bord na Móna, in some respects, in terms of Ireland's actions in this area, was our litmus test, and we failed it quite badly. Now, this has bred mistrust and opposition already, and we're hearing, workers across the economy have watched this unfold. Workers in the energy sector and other sectors have watched this unfold. And the clear message we're hearing back is, we are not going to be the next Bord na Móna. We are not going to be the next ones who are marched out the gate. So already the transition is in trouble in the sense that it has created distrust and mistrust and opposition. And just to remind you as well, I suppose, that when we talk about just transition, this is not a woolly abstraction. This is a very definite concept that emerged from within the global trade union movement about 30 years ago or so. And it has a very specific meaning and very specific measures associated with it. It means structured social dialogue involving trade unions, employers, governments, and the affected communities. It means early intervention in advance of the changes that are expected and not after the fact. It means enhanced social protection where it's required, a heavy focus on upskilling and retraining, and the replacement of quality jobs with quality jobs. There's no point replacing really good jobs. I believe the jobs that were lost in the Midlands were quality jobs. There's no point replacing them with poor, precarious jobs, because the effect on the community, the net effect on the community is lower living standards and a loss of income. A good example of what we haven't done and what we should have done and could have done would be the Plan de Carbon in the north of Spain, the Plan for Cold, which was agreed by Spanish unions, employers, private and public employers, and the government in 2018, just as Bord na Móna was being ripped apart. And funnily enough, the Spanish coal mining industry is of a similar vintage to Bord na Móna in some respects, and was about the same size in terms of numbers employed in the sector, even though it was geographically more diverse. And they alone have already got a commitment for 250 million to be invested in their regions, just from the Spanish government. And they will also be getting a lot more money from the EU. So there's a hugely disproportionate impact there. So essentially, I suppose when we talk about just transition, what we're saying is, what you try to do is sequence the process. So as you close down the older carbon economy, and that's happening, that's going to happen, as you close that down, you try and follow that as closely as possible, or sequence it as closely as possible with the opening of the newer, renewable, greener economy. And you provide a bridge for people from one to the other. And that's for the workers and the communities, so people can move as seamlessly as possible. It's not always going to be possible to make them absolutely seamless, but as seamlessly as possible. The only problem is, all we've done so far, we've done the closing down part. We haven't done the opening up part. We've just done the closing down, the bad stuff. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel on this, and we shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel on this. The core components of how you go about implementing a just transition have been set out very clearly by the International Labour Organization. They produced a very, very clear set of guidelines on implementing a just transition. That was referenced in the Paris Agreement. And of course, Ireland is obviously a member of the ILO, and they go through step by step the measures that you need to see. So it's not that difficult, and it's already been done. It's been done in other countries, as I said, and there are other examples from around the world that we can copy. But what I think I'm afraid of here is, you see, for example, in the recently published Climate Action Plan, that there's a commitment finally, after many years, for the establishment of a National Just Transition Commission. But the schedule laid out in the plan shows it's not going to be operative until mid-23 at the earliest. That's about 5 years too late. So that's kind of our take of where we're at the moment, and where we've gone wrong, and where we need to quickly get back on track, because I think we are rapidly running out of road on this. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Macdara. There's many things I could ask you, but we'll move straight on to our next speaker, Louise Heavin. And like I said, for anyone who's just joined, you're very welcome to pop questions into the chat as you think of them, or save them until all the three speakers have spoken. So over to you, Louise.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me to speak on this. And I kind of really learned a lot from what Macdara just said there, because I guess that's coming from the employees' perspective in Bord na Móna, and a lot of what I know is more about the greater context of what's happening in the Midlands. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that first. And I guess the key thing to note is that the Midlands has been transitioning for decades, like absolutely decades. It's not just happened since 2016 or 2018 or 2021. It's been happening across my lifetime. And for anybody who hasn't, there's a great film that was part of the Cllr Film Festival a couple of years ago called Gone Fods, and I'd recommend anybody, if they can find it. I was trying to find the link for it, I couldn't find it online. Try and it talks about Bord na Móna and what it brought to the Midlands and what has happened to it in the last decades or 2 decades, you know. And you really understand then, you know, why, you know, you pass through parts of Longford or parts of Offaly and they're just like, they're not pleasant places, you know, they're dead, you know, they're empty, they're lifeless. And they've been like that for a very long time, you know. It's not just been since 2016, it's been for a very, very long time. And it's been happening in Bord na Móna because I think they've been losing staff, because they've been changing the ways they're doing things. Everything was becoming more mechanized, and they had less people on site and less labourers needed. So that was happening. We're also in the Midlands a big farming area, and the way we've been farming has been changing. So, you know, we've gone from, again, in my lifetime, gone from being, you know, a lot of small farmers, you know, working on the land to a small number of very large farmers. And that loses employment as well, you know. So there's this been emptying out of, because of Bord na Móna and ESB, and they are changing the way they've done things in Shannonbridge and Lanesborough and whatnot, and on the bogs. The similar things have been happening in the agricultural industry, and people have been, you know, not being employed in that sector as well. And the other thing that's been happening, I think, people have been training in areas that there's jobs in Ireland and elsewhere, and that's not been in industries that are present in the Midlands. You know, there's a lot of people who would go to 3rd level and then go on and move to the cities, you know. So there's been kind of what they call the brain drain, and the same thing's happening in other countries. And all of this has happened and has contributed to, you know, the transition, it not being just for the communities and for what's left behind, but that transition. And I guess for the communities that we're talking about right now, and what Macdara was referencing, that was the last lifeline for a lot of them, you know, for like the likes of Lanesborough, especially when we were canvassing. Bord na Móna's activities was their last lifeline. And the people that I spoke to who worked in Bord na Móna said, well, to be honest, they haven't been hiring in decades, and we're, you know, in our mid to late 50s. I'm not going to reskill in anything else. I'm done, you know. So, and their family then don't see a future for them there, because they know Bord na Móna is winding up. ESB, you know, their activities are winding up. So, you know, it's just this kind of horrible thing that's happened. And the just transition that we say needs to happen, and it needs to happen better. And I guess the big announcements that have happened are welcome. You know, you hear these massive amount of funding that the Midlands are going to get, and there's huge excitement about it, because you're talking about, like, and I know, you know, Macdara referenced office spaces and things, but you are talking about like for example, the harbour building in Kilbeggan is being done up and turned into a co-working space, and they've managed to get small enterprises that have grown to inhabit that space, which is great. But that takes a lot of effort, and actually I think the way they've approached it is backwards, and perhaps not in the way that it should have been. They went out and they said, we've got all this money, what is the community's ideas of what to do with it? You know, everybody submit your ideas. So you're relying then on the volunteers in communities that have been kind of putting in things. You're not actually reaching into, and that's probably why Macdara said, look, we've had so many projects get just transition funding, but so few of them are actually related to the people who were working there. And I'd say that's the structure that they went with in trying to, they announced the funding, who's got a project, stick it in. You know, so all these different people were coming together trying to come up with ideas for projects and putting them in. So I think that's, like, you know, possibly an issue with the way this is being rolled out. The other thing, and a point about feasibility studies that that are being funded through this Just Transition Fund is interesting, because there's this level of match funding that community groups feel that they have to provide, or perhaps the council has to provide, and people are really worried about that. And quite often, like let's say with leader funding, you need to hire consultants yourself. You need to pay for all this yourself before you get a firm application together to actually draw down the big money. So a way around that is applying for your feasibility study. You get the funding for that, and then you apply for the bigger money to do the thing that you want to do, be it convert a building into a co-working space, or start up a small enterprise hub, or whatever it is. You know, you need to get the feasibility study to then get access to the next application, which is much bigger. And yeah, there is a risk then that the community groups and the volunteers, and they are all volunteers, that are putting these applications together, run out of steam or road or people to actually drive this on forward to the next stage. And then, yeah, what have we done? We've funded a whole load of feasibility studies that may or may not ever get used. So that's, I think, something that like needs to be looked at. And the other thing is, like, again, all this money that's going for, you know, just transition, and there is a huge mistrust in Bord na Móna and in what has happened. And there is a concern in the general community out there of the governance. You know, who is in charge of this money and how is it going to be spent? And the other thing is, with the massive emptying out of the Midlands that has happened, and it has happened, there's concern as well that the funding is going to be allocated based on populations. You know, and what has happened is people aren't living in the towns that need the most funding. You know, people aren't living in, you know, Lanesborough. People aren't living in parts of Offaly, you know, and you have lovely towns and lovely historic places, and that, you know, have a small population, but can house a much bigger population, that just need, that they need the attention, and they need the attention not from like whoever's left there, because the people who are left there may have already run out of steam of coming up with ideas and trying to put funding applications together. They need attention from somebody coming in and giving a leg up to these people, and, you know, helping them out and trying to re-energize people and actually get this funding used in the best way it possibly can. So I think there's an awful lot that has to be done. You know, I read a bit of the territorials report, and I think some of it's good, and I have concerns with other, you know, things such as like that never mentioned the arts, you know, in the report at all. And you know, they talk about funding people to reskill and retrofitting and funding third level, and you know, never mention the arts, and people who live in the Midlands, you know, will say, and particularly artists, there's no work for them here a lot of the time. You know, it's difficult to get the funding. If there is a job going in the arts in the Midlands, quite often it's for somebody who's already unemployed. So you don't get somebody who, let's say, wants to relocate to the Midlands. They're from there originally, they want to relocate, they can't. You know, so I think there's a whole thing about arts funding that, you know, could happen. We've got a great tradition of it, and particularly in the areas that are flat and bogland, there's been some great films done. There's been some great musicians come out of that area, you know, and I think like that's something that I would like to see the Just Transition Fund look at, you know, because we are talking about, you know, not only just bringing the communities, you know, that are there, you know, into better employment and giving the communities that are there better quality jobs, but it's also the people who've left over those past 3 decades, you know, making sure that they could come back to quality jobs, to come back to their nice towns, have good quality of life, have the culture around them that they want. And you know, all of that then builds back these communities that have been devastated. So they're my main points, and I'm happy to take feedback and questions. Thanks.
Thanks a million, Louise. Lots of food for thought. Seán, I'll invite you to speak in just 1 second. I just want to check, Macdara, you've got to run. Are we okay to go with Seán first? Great. Okay. Thanks very much. So over to you, Seán.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks for organising this. I found what Macdara and Louise had to say very interesting. I don't really have a huge amount to add, like on what has been said, with regards the lack of any realization of a just transition, particularly in the Midlands. So what I might do is focus on the territorial plan and where it could change things, and how I don't think it will in many ways. I think what Macdara said is key. Like, you know, there's a very clear framework for what a just transition should look like, and nothing else should really be ascribed the term just transition. It's following the ILO principles and adhering to them as laid out. What we could do differently in Ireland to give us a head start, or not a head start because we're about 25 years behind, but to give us a unique advantage in the transition, is look at genuinely giving resources to the Midlands, and not just looking at this through a jobs lens, but looking at it through an ownership of assets lens, and giving assets to the workers who have lost their jobs, so that they can be in charge of their own destiny to some extent. First, just one thing to touch on that hasn't been mentioned, but some people might remember the Loughborough bike hire incident, where you had just transition funding going into Loughborough to support the creation of a bike rental company. When there was a bike rental company already there, it displaced the bike rental company that was already there, and because of the criteria of the tender, gave it to the man, a Dublin footballer actually, who runs the Phoenix Park bike hire. Now, the reason he got it was because in the application you had to demonstrate the ability to hold similar contracts in the past. Now, how you can realize a just transition when you're expecting you're granting money based on the expectation that those receiving it can demonstrate that they've done similar projects in the past, you're immediately excluding all the people who actually need a just transition. So what we have to do is think very differently about how we allocate resources. One example is that we have I have the numbers here in front of me. In Mount Lucas, Bord na Móna own 28 3-megawatt wind turbines. Now, imagine a scenario whereby you have 28 turbines and you take half of them, and you take the revenue from half of those wind turbines, and you say that will go into a shared trust for the workers of Bord na Móna, for them to come up with plans for local enterprise that they would be in ownership of, and it would be funded through this revenue streams generated by those wind turbines. Then we'd be moving into a world where you're not talking about swapping brown jobs for green jobs and trying to figure out whether you can give a man who's 50 years of age a job that he values without having him go through some retraining or moving to Dublin or something like that. What you're actually doing is you're saying, look, we recognize that you understand your place better than anyone, you understand what you want to do better than anyone. What you really just need is the resources to make that happen, whether that's access to the training or the financial resources. In Fintry in Scotland, and people will have probably heard me talk about this before, but the community of Fintry in Scotland is a small community who back about 14 years ago were faced with a large wind farm going in beside them, and they refused to cooperate. So the company came back and offered each household in Fintry, I think, £2,000. And so the community said, well, if they're willing to offer that, they obviously are going to make a lot of money off these wind turbines. So they asked for one of the turbines. Next year, when the loan on that turbine is paid off, that company will get $500,000 a year into a community trust from that turbine. So you can imagine the amount of local development a community can do, especially a small community, with that much money coming in. That's a smaller wind turbine than the ones that Bord na Móna own in Mount Lucas. So like, you know, recognizing that Bord na Móna went into the Midlands initially, as Louise pointed out in that documentary, it went into as a tool to create opportunity for the people of the Midlands. We can't move away from that. And so putting those wind turbines into the ownership of the community is a genuine opportunity for just transition. So taking it a step back, that comes to a question of like courage. Who do we trust communities in Ireland to know what's best for themselves? And do we then put the resources at their disposal to do that? And, you know, I think one of the most frustrating conversations I've had this year was with the consultants putting together the Just Transition Territorial Plan, because there seemed to be no comprehension of the agency of community and the ability for a community to grab hold of an opportunity and run with it. It was very much, how do you bring in someone from the outside to help these people manage their own lives? And that's a real perspective, I think, of someone who's never been involved in community development, doing a job that requires someone who knows an awful lot about community development to do it well. And that's a skills mismatch, right? So if we are to realize a just transition for the workers in the Midlands, and then all of the other communities in Ireland that will be affected by climate policy and whose livelihoods will be threatened by climate policy, we need to put genuine experts in the areas in the positions of formulating the plans, people who know that you can trust community. But then we also have to change our attitude towards decision making as well, particularly at the local level, and start to re-empower both things like the leader program that Louise is talking about, the local action groups, return them to a type of independence. They've slowly become less and less independent as leader has progressed in Ireland, because ultimately over the years, councillors, I think, have gotten jealous of its capability to give community people the ability to fix their own potholes. And then you move up. So you look at that, you look at our failure to embrace the community-led local development, the evolution of leader at the European level. We're not tapping into the community-led local development multi-fund approach yet in Ireland. It's going into its second cycle now. And that's a mechanism whereby all European funds, including the Just Transition Fund, would be required to have a component that could be allocated at the local level for the local community to devise their own plans and how it gets spent. And similarly, we have disempowered local council. So it all speaks to a lack of trust in community. And unless we reverse that, you can have all the Just Transition Commissioners you want and eventually get a Just Transition Commission. We'll still not have the ability, the culture to trust community to take charge of their own futures. So I think it is about that trust, and it is also about looking at the transition and not trying to say, how do we get people green jobs, but ask ourselves, how do we give shared ownership, cooperative ownership of the assets of transition to communities so that they can benefit from those revenue streams and make their own decisions about transition that are best for them, informed by place, informed by what the people in a place want to do, that respects their dignity, respects their need to do something that they value, and not just something that's a job to check a box. So that'll be my perspective on it.
Thanks very much, Seán. And thanks to the three of you. I will open it up to the floor for anyone who wants to ask a kind of a direct question, and particularly mindful that Macdara needs to leave early enough. Sophie.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting as usual. Do we have in Ireland a history that, as Macdara was saying, we don't need to reinvent the wheel of co-ops? I think I had my father-in-law was in. He had shares in some farming co-ops, and then it was dissolved. So is there a strong or good examples of co-ops that have worked and that could be interesting to look at?
It's a great question. Thanks, Sophie. Any takers?
I would just say, look at the dairy sector. All of the major, huge conglomerates now were co-ops. They began their Kerrygold was a co-op. They all began as co-ops, as local cooperatives. Unfortunately, they got the corporate bug, but they were hugely successful in their time.
And so that means that people are used to it, and that same those people would still be alive and still have known. I don't know if it's the dads, or, well, I suppose in dairy, or the grandparents, but we still have this knowledge and memories of that, I suppose, as well, that could be tapped into, really.
I suppose it must be still there in the community. There must be institutional memory somewhere in the community. Yeah.
There's a good book called Civilizing Rural Ireland by Patrick Doyle, and it talks about the cooperative movement and where it came from, because it came as an initiative of a man whose son is now rewilding his Castle and Mead Plunkett. His great-grandfather was Horace Plunkett, who started the cooperative movement in response to crippling poverty in rural Ireland, to try to give agency to the farmers. And they did have it until, like Macdara says, they were kind of sold a gimmick, and their cooperative shares were taken off them for a hybrid PLC model that now is bringing farmers back to that sort of level of poverty. So it is about people collectivizing, I think.
Thanks very much, Sophie. And I suppose sorry.
I don't know how to raise my hand. I apologize for that. I don't know. I'm sure I should know this by now.
Go on.
But I have a question that might actually sow some discord. But from what I'm hearing, and I'm like Midlands renewal is not my area of expertise. Far from it. I do know, like it's different. I think I'm in Limerick, but my father used to work as a creamer manager for one of these cooperatives, and it was like in the 50s that they were really cooperatives. They haven't been cooperatives for a long time, But I'm hearing Louise say almost the opposite of what Seán is saying. Like that I could be wrong about that. That Seán is suggesting that what's needed, and I'm not sure who I agree with, to be honest, or at least who I agree with what I'm hearing. Seán is suggesting that what's needed is more empowerment of local communities, give power to even real assets and monetary power to local councils, who would then decide what to do with it. Whereas what Louise is describing is an attempt to do that, but that you can only get so far on, maybe the difference is that those people that Louise is describing were volunteers, and you can only get so far on volunteer power. Whereas maybe, Louise, you would say that were those same people given money, that it might actually do better? Or are you, Louise, when you hear what Seán's saying, do you agree with him, or do you stick to your guns and say, oh, we need kind of outside help?
I think it's, I guess when I hear what Seán's saying, and I'm thinking about the method in which I saw the Just Transition funding go out, I think what has happened is, and I heard what Macdara said about okay, it's not actually gone to people who are working directly in the industry. That in saying, okay, there's funding, they said it to everybody in the Midlands, and the people who had maybe the strongest applications, who put their hands up, were the people who were already in that zone of like looking for funding, getting out there and going to it. They never went like, you know, I don't know, but I assume nobody went into the community in Lanesborough and said, here's this funding, let's have a town hall meeting here and talk about what we want for Lanesborough now that Bord na Móna is leaving. Now, I don't know if that has happened or hasn't happened, but I am presuming that it didn't, because, you know, the people who I saw getting the funding for their areas are people who are constantly getting funding for their areas and constantly putting in applications. So I think there needs to be a certain level of community empowerment in these communities, you know, that needs to happen. And as I said, like a lot of the people, they might never have been involved in something like this, you know. And I think they're like, communities when they come together are brilliant, but I think, you know, some of these communities are really struggling to get up in the morning, let alone like get down to local hall and get everybody together. And I think there needs to be a certain drive to do that, you know, and as well as that, the depopulation of these communities has happened. You know, you're talking about a lot less people, and a lot of the people who are there who are tired. So I think like it's a bit of, I think it's a bit of both. So it's a bit of somebody going down to help empower the community to help themselves to figure out what they need. But I do think it needs to be bottom up. Like it needs to be, you know, people taking agency over their own communities and their own, you know, environment and their own funding. And I think that idea of like, you know, taking the assets is a good one, or, you know, at least having a share in the assets is an excellent idea, you know, because like even I was at a meeting yesterday and one of the councillors there was talking about like the power stations in, I don't know if it was Shannonbridge or Lanesborough he was talking about, but like the plan is to just deconstruct the power station. He's like, hold on a minute, like I know it's ugly and we've been looking at it for like decades, but like, can't we do something with it? You know, and I thought, yeah, well, if there's a community group there who want to do something with it, you know, and there's funding there, just transition funding, loads of it, you know, to put into something, a project, well then, you know, why can't that just happen? Why is, you know, Bord na Móna or ASB or whoever is making the decision deciding, oh yeah, we're just going to take down this building and, you know, turn it on to rubble and, you know, recycle the aluminium or whatever, like, you know, that's just my take.
No, thanks very much, Louise. Before we move on to other people who have their virtual hands up, Macdara, Seán, is there anything that you want to add to that?
Just in terms of funding the projects, like for example, let me be clear, a lot of those projects that I referenced, probably quite viable and good projects in their own right. But for example, there's an awful lot of tourism projects or tourism related projects that have been funded by the Just Transition Fund, would be more appropriately funded by the likes of Bord Fáilte. There's local authority projects that would be more appropriately funded by the local authority. There's a retrofit project that, well, we now have a national retrofit program that's headed by the SEAI. Are they not the appropriate funders? So it's this misdirect, and I think Louise is absolutely correct. There are some people that are very, very adept and very practiced in some groups because they have huge experience of how to negotiate these systems. And I think it was, as has been referenced, very much a top-down approach. Send us your projects, we'll validate them and check them, and we'll give you the money. Instead of going into the communities and saying, well, what needs to be done?
And just Barty, on that, I think you didn't. I don't know if you're trying, but I think the discord isn't there. I do think there's like no matter what community you go into in the world, certain people have agency and others don't because of their experiences and because of their ability to coalesce together, and those skills need to be supported and developed. And you know, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, there's a commitment to reach the furthest behind first. Now, if you're going to take that approach, you can't just put out funding and say, we'll allocate this based on who has the best application. You're ignoring the need to bring equity to the situation. And equally, that like you need to put in enough money to the community. And so that's the second point, like Macdara is saying about the coal regions in Spain, 250 million, in addition to whatever is coming from the territorial plans, et cetera, et cetera. So like the adequacy of the amounts of money being invested such that they reach everyone is a key point as well. So it's about equity and adequacy in the approach.
No, thanks very much. I mean, from the three of you, it's really clear that those features, equity, dignity, agency, adequacy, they all need to be features of what we learn going into this new range of funding. So thanks very much for that. Naomi, you were first that popped up on my screen. Would you like to unmute and ask your question, please?
Sure, thanks a million. Really interesting conversation, and thanks for organising it. Lots of really interesting points. I'm a sustainable development scientist and a climate adaptation advisor, but I mainly work in Switzerland, where we've had a lot of just transition issues already, simply because we're a little bit further ahead in terms of communities losing a lot of their livelihoods around, like if you think of ski towns, for example, we've lost 500 glaciers already. So communities haven't just lost their livelihoods, they've also lost their homes, they've lost their entire sense of self. So I think it's really interesting to hear how, you know, just throwing money at the situation, absolutely, it doesn't help. It has to be supported, and the trauma and the grief for those people has to be supported as well. So I think that's really key. To give someone dignity, you have to give them, you know, the psychological space to grieve ultimately. And I think it's really interesting what Seán said in relation to, you know, whether, and what a couple of other people have said in relation to it's top down, is it top down or is it bottom up? I think it needs to be both, because as people who make policy, we're often accused of not asking people locally what needs to happen or what they would like to see. So I think it's a really interesting conversation, and I wonder, is that where a hybrid model of, you know, top down and bottom up, and really trying to have someone in that facilitator role, which is what we've had to do here, who's there to take, you know, even simple things like taking meeting minutes and that, just to support people and to move the development process through. It's very disappointing to hear what's happened in these cases, and it's a really interesting session to observe. So it was more just a comment more than a question.
No, thanks very much, Naomi. Is there anything that either or any of the three panelists would like to say in response to that? Very interesting points raised there.
I think like the point about facilitation is a really key one, I think, Naomi, and certainly if we have learnings from that and how it could work better, it would be great. And I think that the point about a grieving community is important, because like kind of when I certainly, and Maeve was on the call here, when we canvassed Lanesborough and this was all happening, they knew their livelihoods was ending just around the corner, and some people were really, really angry at me and Maeve and the Greens for coming in and telling them they can't do the things they do, and some people were just, you know, in despair. They knew it was happening and they knew it wouldn't last forever, and now it was going and there was no plan, you know. They didn't feel there was a plan, you know, and that's I mean, we haven't been back, you know, for a while. I know I've just traveled through that part of the country in Ballydreen, which is nearby. But yeah, I think there's probably an element where, you know, a facilitator needs to come in there and build people back up and help them, you know, help themselves, and see that all is not lost. You know, there has been this big emptying out, but it doesn't have, you know, these places can come back again, you know.
I'd just add that point on facilitation and helping meetings happen. I was very struck when I started to get involved in community engagement in Dublin, how like a street 2 streets over from the next could have an incredibly active residents association that was effectively a lobby group, and was capable of getting local, like every time they had a meeting, every single councillor turned up to it. And then like 3 or 4 streets away, you could have a group who never met, and councillors never went to see them at all. And so like that idea that you would share, you maybe like you could even twin those with good skills in the community in terms of actively engaging with those who haven't got the experience or the history of doing that. I know Austin Campbell in the Robert Emmett Centre down in the Oliver Bond Flats has been working really hard just to get those soft skills embedded within the community there, so that they are able to go directly to their politicians and demand exactly what they need and want. And repeating that all over the country would be very valuable. But I think that also is because our system is a little bit broken in how we deal with people who are not vocalizing their concerns. We, rather than go in and find out why they're not, or like, we just pay attention to those who are voting, I guess. So they're some of the kind of challenges, I think.
Okay, thanks very much. Helen, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to express a few opinions. Just going back to the area of cooperative, we have credit unions in every part of our country, gathering the money of the small saver and all of that, and they're all cooperatives, and they're all people who have and organisations that have money that theoretically is used within the community. I only save in a credit union. I don't understand what, maybe it is distributed in the community or not, I'm not too sure, but we leave that. That's another, what would you say, cooperative. Now, in my view, the big issue with the cooperative is they get too big, they get too powerful, they get too strong. And of course, if you buy a share at €1 and in 10 years' time you can sell it at €5,000, you would want to be a very foolish person not to sell it. So, you know, that is the issue when you grow too big and you're too successful. There's a very good model in Spain where credit union grows to a certain stage. And at a certain stage, it cannot grow any further. It must foster another small business aligned with it. And I think that would be a very, very good model. I don't know if there's any such model in Ireland, but I do know it works very, very well in Spain. The other issue about grants and grant aid, the procedure in relation to getting a grant is 10 times worse than the procedure for a poor young devil going out and doing a Leaving Cert with no education. It is tremendous for even those who are experienced. Time-consuming, time-wasting, we're all looked on as trying to do somebody out of something. And at the end of the day, most of the people who are looking for grant aid are volunteers. They're not paid. They, in a lot of cases, don't have a tremendous amount of experience. The ones who do have great experience, of course, succeed, but it is a hard journey. The leader companies, when they were set up first, and I was part of an interim committee for the leader company in Longford, when it was set up first, we had the opportunity of employing a facilitator who went out to each parish and each town and audited the needs of each community and each person in the community. Now, it was a full year's work and it was a very hard job, but it gleaned a tremendous amount of information about what the people themselves actually needed, not the assumptions of politicians or councillors or other talkers within the community, but the people themselves. And I think all of this funding must address the needs of the people. This is the difficult way of doing the job. It's going for the high fruit. We all go for the low fruit if we can, but this is the difficult way of doing the job. But at the end of the day, it does address the needs of the people. And when you get the people on board and they know you're addressing their needs, any project that's set up will be successful because they know the project is for them. It's not just to get grant aid and just throw it around. You and I see all the white elephants that are around the Midlands. Community centres, millions of euros spent on them. Maybe, 20, 30 days a year they're occupied. If you'd done that in business, where would you be? You wouldn't be in business for very long, yet we can throw lots of money away on things like that. So I think education has a major, major role to play in all of this. And I do think very much that our education system should get off its BS and should get into renewable energy and start teaching people and showing people how they can jump on this great opportunity that we have in relation to having small circular economies where we can provide for our own with the resources within our circle and get independence back for us. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. Some great points raised there, the kind of messy but necessary work of engaging with communities where they're at and empowering them to get where they want to go. Is there anything that you'd like to say, Macdara, on that in terms of the kind of the workers' perspective or the trade union kind of perspective on how those things can be realised?
Look, at the moment, the big problem we have with this entire process is the complete and total lack of engagement, and that's at all levels. And that's the problem we have to address. That if there's engagement, then at least people can have a sense that there's even the beginnings of a plan, or the beginnings of the workings on a plan, and that they may then begin to discern the outline of where we might be going with this into the future. But when all you have is announcements and policy aspirations and publication of plans and so on, and you don't have a tangible, clear, you don't have a local plan in the Midlands for where the region is going. You don't then have a national plan for where any of the sectors of the economy are going. We're talking now about carbon budgets. We're going to be talking about emission cuts across, emission reductions across all sectors of the economy. That has implications for jobs in each and every one of those sectors, but we don't know how those are going to be arrived at, or how people are going to feed into them, or how they're going to be prepared for them in advance of those taking place. So, and unfortunately, I'm afraid on that note, I do have to actually go.
Thanks very much for staying that extra bit of time, Macdara, and for all of your input. Hugely valued. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks for having me. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Before we finish recording, is there anything, Seán or Louise, that you'd like to add to those points in response to Helen's excellent points?
I think, I think they were really good points, and that thing about it being a difficult job and that's why it's not done. I think that's a really key point in all of this. Like, and it happens. I mean, it's happening in a public project I'm involved in, building project. I mean, the consultants took a very easy way out instead of actually like retrofitting the building. They proposed a demolition, which is a terrible idea. But again, it's that kind of messy work. It takes a lot more messing around, and you in the end of the day, you might spend less money and you'll get a better outcome, but it just takes an awful lot more graft in between. I think there was just something I wanted to circle back to that Seán raised, which was a good point as well. And the way this money is being allocated in the public tendering process, which, excludes a lot of people who are starting up businesses or who are reskilled or trying to do something in the Midlands. They can't apply for the tenders, like, you know, and that is something that we had a workshop, as I said yesterday, on this issue. And that was one thing that everybody kept on coming back to, you know, well, we're trying to create more jobs in the Midlands, but actually we can't give any of this money to the people in the Midlands because they're too small, you know, they don't qualify. The public social housing tenders for retrofitting, for example, my company couldn't apply because our turnover wasn't big enough, you know. So like there's fundamental issues with this. And it's back to, like, you know, the jobs always go to the bigger consultants. The bigger consultants have been tendering for longer, and they're generally based in the cities, in Dublin and Galway and Limerick, and they're not based in the Midlands. So, you know, we have this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. The emptying continues. So, you know, that's something that needs to be addressed. And when I raised it at yesterday's meeting, one of the guys, he just didn't see it as an issue. I don't think it registered with him. You know, this is somebody who's working on the Just Transition Plan, and he didn't register it as an issue. Everybody else in the call did, you know. So I think that's a key thing as well. You know, the money has to go back to the Midlands, you know, in some form.
I think the only, just on Helen's point on cooperatives, I think what you're talking about there, Helen, in terms of Spain makes a lot of sense, in terms of limits on growth. In Ireland, we don't have that problem right now. We have a problem in a policy landscape that makes it quite difficult to adopt a cooperative approach. And so actually there's probably a body of research required on how to modernize cooperative legislation in Ireland, and do that urgently, so that you can create a fertile landscape for cooperatives to begin to grow before we start worrying about putting caps on them. But yeah, it does make sense not to let them become massive and ultimately end up evolving into the type of you know, company that sells powdered milk to Vietnam. I think the point on the tendering is really, really important that Louise is raising, and it goes even further than that into things like, you know, we have all of
Seán is frozen. Is that the case for everyone else? Yeah, okay. Oh, you're back on, Seán.
Sorry, folks, don't know what happened there. If I just pick up, and I won't take long. The issue about the tender process goes much further than just tendering. It also goes to things like, you know, how many times in the last 2 years have groups been involved in submission processes to try to shape plans? They're the same people that can tender. They're the same people that, you know, are already in receipt of funds. They're like, the whole thing is rigged to support those who can. It's not, there's not like some sinister plot behind it, but it's rigged, you know, and unless we start to reevaluate those basic structures, we'll continue to not just exclude people, but to drive inequality, because we're supporting those who can and ignoring those who can't. And so that will widen gaps. And so really we need a full, what I'd love to see is a citizens-led review of participation in Ireland in environmental matters, you know, and in, which would include just transition, obviously, but like we need to have I think a cold hard look at the submission process, at PPNs, at things like where citizens' information is going and what happened it under the last government in terms of the removal of its independence. And we have to like rebuild the whole thing in a way that does reach the furthest behind first, as the Sustainable Development Goals require.
Okay, thanks very much. That seems like a good point to end the recorded session on, at least. Thanks very much for the questions, and most definitely to the 3 speakers so far. So you can You can shut us off, Ben.